Kozzy is a PhD student in the Department of Psychology at the University of Cambridge and a student fellow at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence. He works with the Cognitive Intelligence Group on human AI comparisons and benchmarking, and on topics in the philosophy of comparative psychology. And Kozzy, your talk today is a perspective on the associative-cognitive distinction in comparative psychology. Is that right?
It is. Yes, it is.
Over to you then.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. Okay. Are you able to see this? Excellent, excellent. Right, let me get myself sorted. Yeah, thank you very much, Henry, and thank you, Heather and Andrea, for some very interesting talks. So today I'm going to be talking about comparative psychology, and more specifically this distinction between associative explanations for animal behavior and cognitive explanations for animal behavior. I'm going to try to argue for a new way of thinking about this distinction that I think offers a solution to a dilemma about the inferences we can make as comparative psychologists. So the dilemma is as follows. The associative-cognitive distinction has appeared useful in comparative psychology, and it plays a role in a number of useful inferences, but it also plays a role in a problematic inference, namely that as associative explanations become more powerful, they'll eventually phase out cognitive explanations, implying that non-human animals generally lack cognition and behave by mere association, as Cameron Buckner has called it. And I will argue for a new way of thinking about this distinction that preserves its utility, but does not permit. In this way, an alternative title for my talk might be the associative-cognitive distinction Taylor's version or Kozzy's version. It's the same distinction, but in a new context of interpretation. I'm not going to push that joke any further. So first off, what do I mean by associative and cognitive explanations of animal behavior? To give a feel for it, let's say, how do you explain B? If you appeal to an associative explanation, and I'm thinking that explanations typically point to or are mechanisms, then you appeal to explanations in terms of deterministically linking, semantically transparent perceptual events with excitatory and inhibitory connections. So some relatively non-controversial examples are Hebbian mechanisms or simple artificial neural nets. These explanations are often said to be good accounts for less flexible, more stereotyped behaviors. So what does it mean for an explanation to appeal to a cognitive mechanism? Well, this is often defined negatively by a principle of exclusion of sorts, where a cognitive explanation appeals to processes that are not associative. And Cameron Buckner in 2011 and Mike Dacey in 2016 discuss aspect and not so.
Kozzy, maybe just worth noting that we've got some issues with the connection. I don't know if there's anything you can do on your end, but I think it is affecting multiple people here. Most of what you've come through said has come through very clearly, but we've just had a few moments of.
Yes, this might be my connection. Let me hotspot myself. Let's see if that's any better. Sorry, everyone.
These things happen, not to worry at all. We'll just give Kozzy a couple of minutes to see if he can get a smoother connection.
Okay. Is this any better? Can you hear me?
We can hear you. It's a little bit wobbly at the start, but yeah, probably worth a try. We'll let you know if we have any major periods of outage again.
Okay, apologies for that. Thank you. I'll start off on the same slide where I was before, and I'll just start from the top. Okay. So what do I mean by associative and cognitive explanations of and observe? How do you explain that behavior? Well, if you appeal to an associative explanation, and I'm thinking explanations typically are or point at mechanisms, then you appeal to explanations in terms of deterministically linking semantically transparent perceptual events with excitatory and inhibitory connections. Some relatively non-controversial examples are Hebbian mechanisms or simple artificial neural nets. These explanations are often said to be good accounts for less flexible, more stereotyped behaviors. What does it mean for an explanation to appeal to a cognitive mechanism? Well, this is often defined negatively by a principle of exclusion, where a cognitive explanation appeals simply to processes that are not associative. And Cameron Buckner in 2011 and Mike Dacey in 2016 discussed aspects of cognitive explanations in these terms as well. But more broadly and less negatively, cognitive explanations are also described in terms of computation, symbolic representation, propositionality, flexibility, intelligence, and other such notions. The associative-cognitive distinction, then, is this hypothesis, which often manifests as an assumption or even a dogma, that associative explanations and cognitive explanations are two distinct categories or way processes driving animal behavior. Let's look at an example. This is from the literature on metacognition and is discussed by Smith, Couchman, and Baran in 2014. Metacognition is the ability to monitor psychological processes. It's often studied using uncertainty tasks, which gauge the confidence the subject has in making a particular decision. So Smith and colleagues discuss stimulus continua, a well-used paradigm for studying metacognition. Stimulus rectangles are rectangles that can be populated with lit pixels, and I've adapted these here. So this is the case of a 41-step continuum. Animals are tasked with classifying the stimuli as sparse or dense. Correct responses earn a reward, incorrect responses result in a break in testing and no reward. Animals can also produce an uncertainty response, where they decline to complete any trials they choose. In the 41-step case, you'd have 1 to 20 lit pixels being sparse and 22 to 41 being dense. And they suggest that humans have repeatedly shown uncertainty responses near this 21 pixel breakpoint, and have reported being consciously uncertain in these situations. However, due to lack of self-reprovement-like application of the uncertainty response by a non-human animal can be interpreted in at least two ways. It could be that animals are metacognizing, like humans, which would be classed as the cognitive explanation, or it could be that animals are behaving this way through low-level reactions based in aversion and avoidance, in which the uncertainty response is just another associatively learned stimulus response pair, just as the sparse-dense responses are. So here we see the two distinct modes of explanation for a particular behavioral phenomenon, the associative mode of explanation and the cognitive mode of explanation. The associative-cognitive distinction emerges in a number of inferences made in comparative psychology, namely eliminative inferences, parsimony inferences, what I call power inductions, and what Cameron Buckner calls existential threat arguments. I will argue that the first three work together to create these existential threat arguments about the place of cognition in non-human animals. So I'll go through these inferences one by one. Eliminative inferences are scientific decisions made by eliminating alternative explanations until only one remains, the best explanation given the facts. Usually, the elimination of the associative explanation is used to justify cognitive explanations. Much more rarely, you might get the reverse case. So you get the associative-cognitive distinction being invoked here. Parsimony inferences are those cases where several possible explanations equally well explain the data, but some bias for simplicity in some sense means that we favor one over the other. In comparative psychology, this bias often comes in the form of Morgan's canon. You get the associative explanation usually being taken as the simpler account by appeal to a number of things like how widespread those mechanisms are or the complexity of the mechanisms involved. And so all else being equal, often people take the associative explanation as the default. So once again, the associative cognitive distinction is emerging here. Mike Dacey in his forthcoming BJPS paper discusses eliminative inferences and parsimony inferences in comparative psychology in greater detail, and I've drawn a lot of inspiration from that paper. What I call a power induction is when one infers that the success of one explanation implies the future success of future such explanations. This is most commonly talked about with respect to associative explanations. So Mitchell, from experience, we have learned that it is difficult to produce a pattern of data that cannot be explained by one or the other variant of these associative models. People also make more general appeals to the sophistication of so-called associative explanations, such as the fact that recurrent neural nets have been shown in principle to be able to compute anything computable by a classical computer. These inductions are basically about saying that associative explanations will likely be able to explain more and more sophisticated phenomena as time goes on, either because that's what they've done before or because of these general appeals to computational power. These three inferences work together to lead to another, these existential threat arguments. So using the parsimony inference, we often say that associative explanations are the default. They are simpler than cognitive explanations. By the eliminative inference, we would have to eliminate the associative explanation in order to justify the cognitive explanation. By the power induction, associative explanations are going to be getting more and more powerful, and so harder and harder to eliminate. And if we take this to its limit, that means that we will eventually won't be able to eliminate associative explanations. This means that there's no work for cognitive explanations to do, so we might infer that cognition doesn't exist in non-human animals. In other words, there's this existential threat posed to non-human animal cognition. That's how Buckner frames the problem. Evidence for this perceived existential threat to cognition comes from cases where people limit what counts as associative, because they don't want to be too permissive. So in a recent commentary on Smith and Church in 2018, Wills and company seek to limit the class of associative explanations to non-recurrent neural networks because of their theoretically large computational power. I think this derives from an implicit worry about associative explanations phasing out cognitive explanations. So this leads to what looks like a sort of turf war in comparative cognition, with associative explanations inexorably conquering, and by that I mean explaining more and more of the space of possible behaviors, and cognitive explanations desperately trying to hold on to whatever territory they have left. This brings us to this central dilemma. The eliminative inferences and parsimony inferences are useful. So eliminative inferences are often the only way to handle the very complex, and parsimony inferences can be useful too, in my opinion, depending on how they're fleshed out. So I think to remove these inferences out of the arsenal of tools for comparative psychologists would arguably be a problem. And the power induction has not been robustly disconfirmed, and I feel like you'd have a hard time disconfirming it with the recent developments in some areas of associative learning theory, with causal Bayes nets, model-based and model-free, Pavlovian and operant conditioning, comparator models, other Bayesian approaches to animal learning. But intuitively, these existential threat arguments are, at least to me, worrying. Human psychology is predicated on the idea that humans are cognitive, and our behavior can be explained cognitively. We saw that with the reasoning behind uncertainty tasks in metacognition. The existential threat arguments suggest that all non-human animals are fundamentally non-cognitive, since their behavior will eventually be explained by association. This implies a kind of human uniqueness in psychology, and a sense in which the evolution of human psychology underwent a massively significant and discontinuous transition at some point in history, which I find to at least be a troubling inference, and at the very least a premature one to make. So what do we do with this dilemma? We want to keep the eliminative inferences and the parsimony inferences, but these existential threat arguments seem at least to be premature, at worst worrying. I see a few options. The first is eliminativism. We could retire the notions of associative and cognitive explanations in comparative psychology. We could say that these notions are no longer fit for purpose for contemporary comparative psychology. Then it makes no sense to talk of the success of associative explanations and their being mutually exclusive from cognitive explanations. And so existential threat arguments stop making sense. But they have shown to be useful notions, especially in these eliminative and parsimony inferences. They're generally useful in coming up with controls for studies, or as starting points for conceiving of alternative explanations for a particular observed behavior. And what would we replace them with? I mean, comparative psychology is hard enough as it is without getting rid of this apparently useful framework for thinking about animal minds. So the second option is normativity. We could a priori define what kinds of things associative and cognitive explanations are. Then there's no scope for associative explanations phasing out cognitive explanations because the amount of turf they can conquer is fixed in advance. And we can still do eliminative and parsimony inferences. But who gets to decide? How do we know that these definitions will be fit for purpose? And surely it's the job of the science to empirically find definitions of these terms. I think you have to have a pretty bold metaphysics to think that that approach would work. So the final option I see is mereological. We could decompose the notions of associative and cognitive explanations into smaller, more manageable chunks. We say that the associative and cognitive explanations are convenient wrappers for a more complex situation. So we can use them in broadly in eliminative and parsimony inferences until the details get in the way. And the details definitely get in the way with the existential threat arguments. You know, you might say, are associative explanations going to phase out cognitive explanations? Well, that depends on what you mean by associative and cognitive. They're actually more complex than they appear. So this mereological solution is the one I find most promising, and that's what I'll be looking at more deeply here. There are two ways to do the decomposition. The first is to decompose it across the board. We say that the distinction is an unhelpful binary that includes a more complex multidimensional space of similarities and differences. And this is what I think Starzak and Gray 2021 do for causal cognition. We might call this ontological pluralism, but ontological pluralism seems to be too brash. Is dualism really that bad everywhere? Or can it be useful in some context? Do we really want to put a blanket ban on the associative cognitive distinction for all of comparative psychology? That almost seems like it could be a slippery slope to defining the metaphysics of animal minds in advance. We're saying, okay, you can have 3 kinds of explanations, 4 kinds of explanations, but not 2 kinds of explanations. So the other option is methodological pluralism. We could say that the distinction can be useful, but not everywhere. It's perhaps not fit for purpose across the whole of comparative psychology. The way the distinction manifests might be different depending on the subdomain of comparative psychology in question. This is something that has heavily drawn on conversations with Ali Boyle and about P.D. Magnus's approach to natural kinds. I'm thinking about associative and cognitive explanations as pointing at natural kinds in Magnus's sense, although I'm not sure I have to be committed so much to the associative and cognitive are delineated depending on their success in particular subdomains. And this delineation may be different for different domains, and they're not necessarily commensurable, and they don't really have to be, so long as they engender success in that domain. And by success, I'm talking broadly about descriptive and explanatory adequacy, predictive utility, and things like that. What this means is that we can have eliminative inferences and parsimony inferences and power inductions happening, but they're circumscribed by the domain at hand. And this is good because these kinds of inferences have been and are useful in day-to-day comparative psychology research. But what it does is block the existential threat arguments. This is because existential threat arguments are inductions across all subdomains of comparative psychology. The success of associative explanations in one domain is inherited by other domains. But this is blocked in the methodological pluralist approach because you can't say for sure that the associative cognitive distinction used in one domain is the same as that used in another. Thinking about comparative psychology as a loosely connected network of subdomains is not an unusual way to look at a science. Arguably, theoretical linguistics is structured in a similar way, with subdomains corresponding to syntax, phonology, semantics, pragmatics, etc. There are points of overlap, and the inferential tools used in different subdomains aren't necessarily the same, and they don't have to be. There are some further benefits to the methodological pluralist approach. A lot of the dialogue on the associative cognitive distinction has been wrestling with the fact it plugs nicely into the eliminative inference and the parsimony inferences sometimes. And in the history of comparative psychology, it seems to have been fruitful. Not that I have touched on that today. But on the other hand, it sometimes just doesn't fit. It's like a square peg in a round hole. And trying to come up with a unified account has either resulted in eliminativist or normative strategies. With methodological pluralism, we can have both. Just as we can have different manifestations of the distinction in different domains, we are also not necessarily bound to a cardinality of 2 in every domain. We could be ontologically monist in one domain, pluralist in another, and dualist in yet another. And I think the pluralist in the domain of causal cognition is the direction that Starzak and Gray 2021 go in. What does this mean for the researcher? Well, I think that day-to-day research can go on unchanged. The associative-cognitive distinction can be plugged into eliminative inferences, parsimony inferences at the level of individual experiments, and for the interpretation of specific results, investigating specific hypotheses. But in wider commentary and theory, we must avoid generalizing what scientists mean by associative explanations and cognitive explanations beyond the domain of inquiry, and making these general inferences based on that. And in this way, we can avoid this troubling idea of an existential threat to comparative cognition. There are a few issues to work out with this picture of things. So how do we individuate domains? Well, I'm inclined that we could individuate according to cognitive capacity, as Ali Boyle has suggested in conversation. What this means is that there could be a distinction between associative and cognitive explanations when we're talking about metacognition in non-human animals, one for causal cognition, one for theory of mind. And these distinctions don't have to be the same or even binary. Domains are therefore individuated by the cognitive capacity in question. I haven't quite worked out how feasible this idea is. Maybe we could think about phylogenetically individuating domains. I think it's also important to be clear that I don't think this view implies that domains must be sharply delineated or fixed. There can be dynamic, fuzzy boundaries between domains, but these liminal cases will require careful consideration when we engage in inferences that invoke an associative cognitive distinction, more so than when we're pretty firmly in the domain of, say, causal cognition. How do we go about finding where the distinctions or lack thereof lies in each domain? Well, I have some ideas. So Buckner 2011 discusses two approaches for kind of stabilizing where the distinction is in terms of comparing models or explanations, and in terms of comparing actual animal behaviors in a kind of success testing approach, with these two antagonistic methods allowing a distinction to stabilize and manifest over time. Mike Dacey's 2021 evidentialist approach might also have an application here too. Does this pluralism mean a slippery slope to anti-realist pragmatism? You know, if we have different distinctions in different domains, are we studying anything real or just studying things that are useful to progress? Well, I'm not sure that's much of a criticism if you assume that what is successful aligns pretty well with what is real, but there are just so many different ways of viewing the same phenomena. And I think we can be modestly realist and still hold this view, and indeed that's the perspective that Magnus comes from in his discussion of natural kindness. And finally, does this mean that talk about explanations in comparative psychology is incommensurable across domains? I'm not sure. The inferences across domains are blocked, but can we still talk in general terms? Perhaps incommensurability requires domains to be sharply defined and informationally encapsulated in some sense, which as an idea I'm not totally on board with if we take this model of how theoretical linguistics is structured, but that's still a question mark. So to briefly conclude, the associative cognitive distinction is invoked in several inferences in comparative psychology. Some of these are good, some of these are intuitively worrying, or at least premature, and seem to contradict gradualist intuitions about the evolution of cognition. And these inferences are these existential threat arguments. To escape this impasse, I propose that we take a methodological pluralism approach, where comparative psychology is not one single field with one single associative cognitive distinction that is useful, but actually it's several loosely linked domains of inquiry with different distinctions that have different utility. And in this way, we can block these general inductions about the presence or absence of cognition in non-human animals and move on to more substantive debates. Thank you very much. Yeah, as I say, this is a work in progress, so any comments or concerns would be greatly appreciated.